And tonight it is sponsored by the Division of Literature and Languages, but we're really excited because it's also sponsored by the Native American Awareness Week that we are almost in the middle of. I've asked Belda Penny, who is a former student at LCSC, a graduate of the college, and currently the director of the Nez Perce Head Start program, to introduce the Stegner lecture for tonight. Belda?
Good evening. It's my pleasure to be here, and it's really neat to see how Indian Awareness Week has really grown. I'd like to introduce to you Linda Hogan. She's a Chickasaw, and she's a poet, a novelist, and an essayist. She is the author of several books of poetry, a collection of short fiction. Her novel, Mean Spirit, published by Athenaeum, received the Oklahoma Book Award for Fiction, 1990 in the Mountains and Plains Bestseller Association Fiction Award. Her book, Seeing Through the Sun, received an American Book Award from the Before Columbus Foundation. Hogan is the recipient of the NEA grant, Guggenheim Fellowship, Minnesota Arts Board grant, Colorado Writers Fellowship, and the 5 Civilized Tribes Museum Playwriting Award. She is an associate professor at the University of Colorado, has served on the National Endowment for the Arts Poetry Panel for 2 years, and is involved in wildlife rehabilitation as a volunteer. I'd like to introduce to you Linda Hogan.
I like the civilian tribes, 5 civilian tribes. Put in for a formal change. Well, it's good to be here tonight, and I feel honored to be a Stegner lecturer, and the 10th one at that. I'd like to start out tonight reading a poem, and I'm picking this particular poem because I think it says a lot about different views of land, traditional views of land, and more contemporary and European views. And this is called Celebration, Birth of the Cold. When we reach the field, she is still eating the heads of yellow flowers, and pollen has turned her whiskers gold. Lady, her stomach bulges out, the ribs have grown wide. We wait, our bare feet dangling in the horse trough, warm water where goldfish brush our smooth ankles. We wait while liquid breaks down ladies' dark legs, and that slick, wet colt, like a black tadpole, darts out, beginning at once to sprout legs. She licks it to its feet, the membrane still there, red, transparent. The sun coming up shines through. The sky turns bright with morning, and the land with pollen blowing off the corn, land that will always own us. Everywhere it is red. And I wanted to read a quote by a Comanche traditionalist, Sanapia, who says, "You touch the ground with your hands 4 times, and you say, Mother Earth, I want you to take my words. I want you to do what I want. I am walking over you. I live on you and I love you." One of the things I'm going to focus on tonight is a sort of a reciprocal giving, a sort of caretaking between land and humans. And I've been really very interested for years now in issues having to do with wilderness. And one of the reasons I began thinking about just the language wilderness, the use of the word, was because fish, wildlife, forests, all wilderness issues are under the same department that Indian people are under, as though somehow humans and the land are the same. And of course, my family comes from Oklahoma, and Okla and Homa means red people, land. And the word itself unites people in a traditional view of the human world and the natural world being one and the same, and that there is some sort of a reciprocal vision there. And I liked what Santa Pia said, because she acknowledged not only that she wants something back, but that she's giving something. And also that she uses the language that's so meaningful and so strong, the word "I love you." And I felt like that was very important. There's an Iroquois traditionalist who is, since I've known him, has become an elder, Oren Lyons, who went to, in 1977, there was a conference in Geneva, Switzerland, which was a non-governmental organizations conference that had to do with the rights of indigenous people in North and South America. And at that time, Oren Lyons came in and said, well, I don't see the eagles represented here. I don't see a seat for the eagle. I don't see a seat for the deer. And he said, we forget, we humans forget, and we consider ourselves superior. But we are, after all, a mere part of this creation. And we must consider to understand where we are. And we stand somewhere between the mountain and the ant, somewhere and only there, as part and parcel of creation. Well, these are things that have been of lifelong interest to me. What is the human place here on earth? How do we show our respect to the land, and how do we receive in return from the land? And I feel like collectively, all of us in this country, and possibly in a much larger context, that we're at the end of a way of living and the end of a way of being and thinking, and something new is being demanded of us now, and we don't know what. And when I travel quite a bit and work in a variety of communities, and I find people in despair over the situation that we seem to be facing now. And I've noticed also that it seems like our systems are breaking down. The legal system, which maybe broke down a long time before, actually. Our systems of belief, our systems of caretaking, and the natural cycles as well. And so we need to begin putting things together in a new way. When I used Santa Pia's language, I wasn't exactly thinking of her words, even though she's a traditionalist and a healer, was a traditionalist and a healer. I wasn't thinking of her words in terms of ceremonial language, but for most ceremonies that tribal people have, there is in the ceremony itself the sense of the place of the human being in context with all of the rest. And in Oren Lyons' words, looking for that place is what's significant. And when we find that place, we are somehow restored, we are remade. For Lakota people, the saying is all my relations. We are looking for a voice to put things together. And I've also been thinking, since unfortunately I've had to be thinking this year about Columbus and quincentennial, because my phone rings all the time with people calling because they want an Indian to be present somewhere, since all of a sudden they've had to rethink Columbus. His journals were published a few years late. And I went over his journals and I was pretty dismayed, and it seemed so clear the kind of mindset that was at work when he talked about how peaceful the people were that he met on this continent, and then said in the very next breath that they would make very good slaves because they were peaceful and unarmed. But I also, in terms of thinking now about the land, one of the things that I see that's happened in the colonization of this country is that the Europe that was being left behind, really, at that time, was a Europe that was full of plague, Europe that had been deforested, that had had a failed agriculture. The reason that people were searching for new places to explore was they were not coming to this continent in search of friendship. They were coming here in search of resources, which is still an ongoing issue with tribes in this country, that being put on places that are places where there's large reserves of gas, oil, uranium, coal, and other kinds of resources. And hydroelectric power, I suppose. Water is really an issue up here. But the thing that seems so interesting about it was that bringing a failed system from one country and setting up the same system to another in another country, only to have it begin to break down and fail in the same way it had in Europe, seems to be what's happened. And I've thought a lot too about our mindset, just sort of in a general way, and I don't mean to generalize about everybody thinking alike, but one of my favorite writers, one of the people that I think is a more interesting writer in this country right now is a fellow named John Hay, Hay, who in 1947 wrote a book called The Run. And he had been in World War II, beginning at what he calls a murderous century, with the wars and the history of this time. And he went home to Cape Cod. He's a white man, and he grew up in what you would call a North American noble family. They were blue bloods. They come from a tradition of wealth and ownership. And he witnessed a run of alewives at Cape Cod fish, and his life was transformed by this run of fish. He began to think about what drove them. He began to think about the inner world, the kind of knowing that we don't always acknowledge, the kind of knowing that's deeper than our daily conscious knowing. And then he went through a great transformation. A couple of his newest books, the last one was The Immortal Wilderness, and he's brilliant in his thinking, and I wish his first book came out the year I was born, but I wish I'd known about what he was working on earlier than a few years ago, because it would have made a lot of difference in my thinking and my life. But one of the things that he said that I think was very strong to me was that he used to think that people were governed by logic and rationality, but now that he's older, he realizes most people are governed by rage and fear. Most of us are driven by rage and by fear. And unfortunately, I'm afraid he's very close in that. He also talks about when you pay attention, when you look at the land, or when you study any species, or when you study anything, once you start the process of seeing, opening your vision, you see magnitudes where once you saw objects. That anything examined yields up a wealth of information and is a mystery. And then he also says things that I like. Things like, I learn from everything I don't own. And then one of my favorite is, never consider a day wasted that you didn't read the newspaper. And I'm starting to think that history does repeat itself every day at the doorsteps of many people. And part of that breaking out of fear and rage is rethinking relationship and all the meanings of that word. Not just our relationships with other people, but with an expanded idea of community relationship within the community of the land and the animals and the plants as well. And the old way of thinking, when there was the fire in Yellowstone, one of the rangers said for people not to feed the elk that were starving because there was no evidence that animals feel pain, to which I called the radio station really fast to mention where endorphin studies were done was on animals. And also that anyone who's worked with animals talks about not only their ability to feel pain, but even the emotional lives of them. There's a wonderful book by Cynthia Moss called Elephant Memories, where she talks about the grief that elephants have when they lose one of their community members or family. And Jane Goodall, of course, has done years of research on whoever the species was, it just escaped me, but she talks about the feeling world, the obvious emotional world. And I've, working in wildlife rehabilitation as a volunteer, the woman that I work under is this sort of magic person with birds, and we often get I worked in a vet school before, and it's a very aggressive form of handling that they would practice there. And she's completely different. She does everything wrong. She's subjective instead of objective. She gives the birds names, and she's not supposed to do that because it's not objective. But the minute she touches one of the birds, they stop. They know that they're being helped. We had an eagle that came in from the vet school at CSU in Fort Collins. The killer eagle was what they called it. Who, when Sigrid took a hold of it, it closed its eyes and she cleaned its beak and said in her Austrian accent, "There, there." We're also needing to consider a new vision in other ways as well, and as our own places being smaller, the human place being smaller, and being in context with everything else. I'm going to read a poem called Rain. I'm going to intersperse reading with other things tonight. Some of my main interests are natural history and science, and a lot of things I learned maybe years later than other people did. This particular poem came about when I learned that water on Earth and in our atmosphere is always exactly the same. It remains constant. We never lose a drop of water to beyond our atmosphere. We never gain a drop of water. And when you consider this roundness and this cycle of water, and you think about how many people there are, it is really incredible that we have water. And I like to look in the tap and think of it being the Pacific Ocean and the Nile River, and all of these things come around again. And this is called Rain. Rain's story falls to earth. It tells corn and wheat such tales they believe, and rise up thin air. This falling water is Africa rising. Unfold the maps. In all towns rain has fallen, life surged up and turned to bones again. Rain passes on stories of people. Some are loved in deep green jungles. Some are tortured in mesquite hills. In this town, a man was given something sharp to swallow and no water. Rain said, "Drink me." Here they tell us, do not sing, do not speak the name of rain with its revolutionary brewing of life in death's harvest time. Forget what has happened in the round world. Rain is banished for making life and carrying songs and secrets over state lines. So tell this from behind bars and the living rooms of homes, from underground where springs are flowing. Tell your children and mothers, rain beats on roofs. Men are forced to swallow sharpness. Flour sacks are pilfered by the full. Lord have mercy, rain is falling. It wants to touch our hair and skin, wants to touch us. And everyone knows the stories of rain and where it came from. That's why they go inside and bolt the door and turn buttons of machines off and on, even though the grass is growing back again. And everything we swallow is the rain, and birth waters are breaking down the sturdy legs of sky. Speaking of water, suddenly got a craving. I want to read a poem by writer Jimmy Durham, who is a Cherokee, Kituwa band Cherokee. And he was one of the organizers of the International Treaty Organization and lived in Geneva where he worked for tribes for years. And this is called The Teachings of My Grandmother. In a magazine too expensive to buy, I read about how, with scientific devices of great complexity, U.S. scientists have discovered that if a rat is placed in a cage in which it has previously been given an electrical shock, it starts crying. I told my grandmother about that, and she said we probably knew that would be true. In another magazine, I read about a man who spent 20 years of his life studying why birds sing. He made thousands of tape recordings, mechanical singing devices, and artificial birds. He also killed many birds to study them and put others in cages so they wouldn't fly away during experiments. In the end, he learned that birds sing to communicate to each other, and that each bird has its own song, besides the regular communication songs. I told my grandmother about that, and she said, 20 years, how did he support his family then? I explained that the government and the university paid him to do that. She said, we probably knew that would be true. I love reading that in universities and colleges. Thanks. Most non-Indian people don't realize that in the United States, it was 1978 before the Indian Religious Freedoms Act was passed here, and the Bureau of Indian Affairs had banned tribal religions around about 70 years earlier, and consequences were incarceration and other kinds of things. In the same year, the Indian Child Welfare Act was passed. And I feel like it's important to talk about the Indian Religious Freedoms Act because it's in the process of being amended now. At Native American Rights Fund, there's ongoing work on amending the law, the legislation, in order to move aside from the language that is interpreted in the incorrect way, which I sound like a lawyer when I say this. But the problem is that because so much land, sacred land, is involved in religious participation for Indian people, the law has been interpreted in ways that allow for loopholes so that it is not legislation that's working for Indian people, hence the amendments. And I think that this is another part of looking at our history and looking at the history of what's happened with land, which is that unfortunately, laws have not protected the people who need to be protected by law. And so economic interests have always come first and continue to do so. And even in some case, not only for mining and ranching and other kinds of activity that needs land to transpire, but there are even situations where golf courses take priority over tribal lands and over religious sacred sites that have for centuries been a part of the religion of people. And I think we need to start thinking about the deeper and the older laws and some of the things that go below the language of the American legal system. And I wanted to read a poem about, it's called Carrie, and it is really about moving into that deeper space. But it begins with the image of a fish that is caught. This poem came from Lake Superior, Isle Royale, where, following my interests, I ended up taking a course on research on wolves in Ely, Minnesota, and went over to this island to take a class to look at the wolf and moose population over there. And actually, I learned more about wildlife biologists than I did about the wolves because they were really intelligent and they could hear our boots in the snow. Nobody counted on that, so they were never around. So the only time we saw wolves was when we were in an airplane. And they were just these little fuzzy things down there on the ground. But this fish was caught, and it had something trailing from it. And so when it was pulled out of the water, It turned out that what was trailing from it was the skeleton of an osprey, that an osprey had put its talons in this fish that was too large and been carried down. From water's broken mirror we pulled it, alive and shining, gasping the painful other element of air. It was not just fish, there was more. It was hawk, once wild with hunger, sharp talons locked into the dying twist and scale of fish, its long bones trailing like a ghost behind fins through the dark, cold water. It was beautiful, that water, like a silver coin stretched thin enough to feed us all. Smooth as skin before anyone knew the undertow's rough hands, lived inside it, working everything down to its absence. And water is never lonely. It holds so many. It says, come close, you who want to swallow me. Already I am part of you. Come near. I will shape myself around you so soft, so calm I will carry you down to a world you never knew or dreamed. Down to a world you never knew or dreamed. I will gather you into the hands of something stronger, older, deeper. Another thing in thinking about wilderness, I'm going to read some poems for a while, but in thinking about it, psychologist C.A. Meyer has said that as the wilderness outside diminishes, the wilderness inside people grows. And what he's talking about isn't the kind of wilderness that we're thinking of. A lot of times we have very romantic ideas of wilderness, and fail to think that it's the place where we're likely to get eaten. but as that element that's outside of human control in wilderness is gone. It happens inside of us, and I think that he talks about the violence that faces our society and situations such as the attack of the woman in New York with the young men who were out wilding. That was the word that they used. Their perception of rape and murder was that it was wilding. Crow law. The temple where Crow worships walks forward in tall black grass. Betrayal is Crow's way of saying grace to the wolf so it can eat what is left when blood is on the ground, until what remains of moose is Crow, walking out the sacred temple of ribs in a dance of leaving the red tracks of scarce and private gods. It is the oldest war, where moose becomes wolf and crow, where the road ceases to become the old forest, where Crow is calling, where we are still afraid. When I was in Minnesota, what really interested me a great deal about the wolf and the crow was their cooperation, that the crow tell the wolf packs where the moose is, so they can eat the leftovers. They're often sitting in the ribs of the animal, having the last meal. Okay, there's a poem I wanted to read called Mountain Lion. And I used to live in Oregon, in the Blue Mountains, and one day I was outside and I sat up. I was down on the ground and I sat up, and there was a mountain lion standing fairly close that saw me, the top predator of the list there, and it took off and ran. And the town where I live now in Colorado, we have, I guess I should say, we don't have mountain lion problems. Mountain lions there have human problems because in the newer areas around the mountains, there are housing developments going in, and so a lot of animals are being displaced, including mountain lions, bear, and others. And the consequence of that, and one of the things that we have to think about when we're thinking about wilderness issues, is the territory of the animals, and what happens when human territories and other territories overlap. And in this particular case, in the town up above ours, a high school boy was killed by a mountain lion while he was out jogging, which is something that should never have happened, but did, and caused everyone to stop and reconsider their idea of what it was like to have these wonderful animals living alongside of us. Mountain lion. She lives on the dangerous side of the clearing, in the yellow-eyed shadow of a darker fear. We have seen each other inside mortal dusk, and what passed between us was the road ghosts travel when they cannot rest in the land of the terrible other. Red spirits of hunters walked between us from the place where blood goes back to its wound before fire, before weapons. Nothing was hidden in our eyes. I was the wild thing she had learned to fear. Her power lived in a dream of my leaving. It was the same way I have looked so many times at others, in clear light, before lowering my eyes and turning away from what lives inside those who have found two worlds, cannot live inside a single vision. It's a sort of complicated poem to read out loud. And I wanted to, before I get my notes totally mixed up here, read a poem by Carolyn Forshey, because one of the things I've found in working on this new book of poems, which is called Hunger and the Book of Medicines, was that the thinking about wilderness, which the book is about, and thinking about hunger, made me also think about what motivates us, and not just the fear and the rage that John Hay talked about, but going even further into the self, the hunger, the greed. And I felt like for most people, for most of us, it's really hard to examine certain aspects of our own selves, and that I needed to think about that, and that I needed to, particularly in thinking about the language of poetry, which is language that is highly condensed and has the most power. It's the most highly charged electrical language that we have, besides prayer and ceremonial language. I felt like it was really important to try to get to all the places that existed. And Carolyn Forshey came to my mind when I was working on this quite often, because probably many of you know who she is. She's an American writer, North American writer, who was in Spain doing translations of a woman from El Salvador. And when she came back to the United States, one night there was a knock on her door, and she answered the door, and there were two men, and they asked her if she would go to El Salvador to be a human rights investigator. And she said, well, I'm just a poet. Why would they want me? Because nobody listens to poets. And they said, well, that's why we want you, because everybody listens to poets, and because in their country they do. And so she thought it over, and she went, and barely escaped, finally, with her life. And had to be witness to unspeakable terrors and horrors of what human beings do also to one another. And here's a poem called The Visitor by Carolyn. In Spanish he whispers, there is no time left. It is the sound of scythes sparking in wheat, the ache of some field song in Salvador, the wind along the prison, cautious, as Francisco's hands on the inside, touching the walls as he walks. It is his wife's breath slipping into his cell each night while he imagines his hand to be hers. It is a small country, There is nothing one man will not do to another. So I'm going to read a few things to you, and they're in line with the topic. Actually, this topic is sort of like organic chickens, kind of free-ranging. I don't know if they have those out here. They're big in Colorado. But it has to do with that land and with the laws of the land and the laws that are deeper than human laws. This is called Great Measures. The first time a lover held me, I was young and gave myself to creation. I was hand, body, liquid, ruled by dark seas that swallow the edges of land and give them up to another place. I am still this measure of brine, ancient carbon, the pull of iron across linked and desperate distances, beginning and end together, the way sunlight on skin is still connected to the fiery storms of its origins. I'm thinking this today, candling eggs, to see inside the oval white, which yolks are quickened with a spot of blood. Once these were wilder birds, who would go to any lengths to follow the magnetic longings of stars. Makers of eggs, this living is such a journey inside a breaking open world, the way a turtle, free of its shell, believes in water, getting its bearings across the stretch of sand, that distance of dark water, breaking, gaining, running for shelter. But when it swims, it remembers the sand it is ruled by. This is in keeping also with the same thing of dropping deeper into what's human until we're more than the power of positive thinking. And it's called The Ritual Life of Animals, and I have the last line of it is a line from Martha Graham. She was a really interesting essayist when she talked about dance, because her way of looking at dance moved over into all other disciplines, really. Several years ago, I was at an arts institute for a summer. It was a high school institute, and I was teaching writing. And I was the only writing teacher there, and the others were photographers, actors, dancers, and musicians, and all the other disciplines. And it was really interesting because we all had to give a craft lecture, and every person said the same thing, whatever their discipline was, that what you're doing engages the whole person, and it begins with the ground and it moves into the feet. And that any time you're doing that kind of creative work, you're using everything that's available. And you enter a sort of timelessness, which is why people like to do that. But this is called The Ritual Life of Animals. The animal walks beside me, long-toothed partner in a sacrificial dance. It lies down on the land as I walk upright. It has come from the swampy beginnings of blood, lung, hand. Killing is the prayer before its every meal. And in the dark nocturnal waking, there's the falling to all floors, a wild seeing, other ears hearing. After breathing and clawing is the solemn rite of sleep that crosses into dream, that holds counsel with foreign tongues and common hungers. In the sleeping bird, the dream is flying south. The male is the dance before the female, and there is fear. I am the enemy, dreamed in the restless sleep of whale. Bird, those who possess the desperate gifts of feigning death, running, turning the color of snow. In the silence of night, in the warmth of human bodies, are the nocturnal wakings. Something inside gets down on its haunches. At the borders of our beds are the strange ways, voices, the slow shifting of eyes, turning of ears. They hear us, smell us, dream us. We lie down in the long nights of their waking, the house of animal law, the house of pelvic truth. I'm going to read a few more poems, and then I'm going to read some fiction, because I know that most people are more interested in fiction than they are in poetry. And Mean Spirit has gotten, it's been very different than being a poet, because you never tell people you're a poet when you're a poet. People ask me what I do, I just say I teach school, because otherwise, they kind of look at you really funny. But when you write fiction, you can actually say you're a writer. I think it's a little bit more somehow acceptable. And these poems also, they're hard to listen to. They're not all really very happy poems, because they required something different of me than the kinds of work I'd ever done before. And I'm going to read one called Return Buffalo. I live near a buffalo herd, which is really quite incredible, and I like to go up during calving season, but I also think about buffalo a lot, and I think about the changed continent and the history of the buffalo. And because it's been written about and talked about so often, it's become something of a cliche. And so I felt that as a writer, one of the things I really wanted to do was to go back over the emotional material, the things that have become so overused that people no longer see them as what they are. They're not infused with any weight. And it seemed that the job here was to go back and to find a way to make this significant leap again, and to be able to talk about buffalo in a way that renewed the thinking about what had happened. And it's called Return. In the field of a dark history, in the bones of their mothers, we have come to see them give birth. One man made a ladder of stacked up yellow bones to climb the dead toward his own salvation. He wanted light and fire, wanted to reach and be close to his God. But his God was the one who opened his shirt and revealed the scar of mortal climbing. It is the scar that lives in the house with me. It goes to work with me. It is the people I have loved who fell into the straight, unhealed line of history. It is a brother who heard the bellowing cry of sacred hills when nothing was there but stories and rocks. It was what ghost dancers heard in their dream of bringing buffalo down from the sky, as if song and prayer were paths life would follow back to land. And the old women, they say, would walk through that land, pick through bones for hide, marrow, anything that could be used or eaten. Once they heard a terrible moan and stood back, and one was not dead, or it had come back from there, walked out of the dark mountains of rotted flesh and bony fur like a prophet coming out from the hills with a vision too unholy to tell. It must have traveled the endless journey of fear, returned from the far reaches where men believed the world was flat, and they would fall over its sharp edge into pitiless fire. And they must have thought how life came together was a casual matter, war a righteous sin, and betrayal wasn't a round, naked thing that would come back to them one day. And then this last poem I'm going to read is called History of Red. First there was some other order of things, never spoken, but in dreams of darkest creation. Then there was black earth, lake, the face of light on water. Then the thick forest all around that light, and the human clay whose blood we still carry rose up in us who remember caves with red bison painted in their own blood after their kind. A wildness swam inside our mothers, desire through closed eyes, a new child wearing the red, wet mask of birth, delivered into this land already wounded, stolen, and burned beyond reckoning. Red is this yielding land, turned inside out by a country of hunters with iron, flint, and fire. Red is the fear that turns a knife back against men, holds it at their throats, and they cannot see the claw on the handle, the animal hand that haunts them from some place inside the blood. So that is hunting, birth, and one kind of death. Then there was medicine, the healing of wounds. Red was the infinite fruit of stolen bodies. The doctors wanted to know what invented disease, how wounds healed from inside themselves, how life stands up in skin, if not by magic. They divined the red shadows of leeches that swam in white bowls of water. They believed stars in the cup of sky. They cut the wall of skin to let what was bad escape. But they were reading the story of fire gone out, and that was a science. As for the animal hand on death's knife, knives have as many sides as the red father of war who signs his name in the blood of other men. And red was the soldier who crawled through a ditch of human blood in order to live. It was the canal of his deliverance. It is his son who lives near me. Red is the thunder in our ears when we meet. Love, like creation, is some other order of things. Red is the share of fire I have stolen from root, hoof, fallen fruit, and this was hunger. Red is the human house I come back to at night, swimming inside the cave of skin that remembers bison. In that round nation of blood, we are all burning, red, inseparable fires the living have crawled through and climbed through in order to live, so nothing will be left for death at the end. This life in the fire, I love it, I want it, this life. It's so nice to be here speaking of life and seeing all the new life coming back and the grass. We don't have spring in Colorado yet. And the will to live is very strong for most of us, except on bad days. I'm just going to read a few sections of Mean Spirit. One of the things that's nice about working in fiction is that, your characters can be very opinionated. They have very strong opinions, and it's not you saying it, so you can say all kinds of things. And my characters are all very, Belle Gray Cloud is one of my favorites. I say this about all of them, but she's my role model for what I want to be like when I'm older, because she becomes a political activist who at one point in the book holds the law at bay to protect a cave and bats. And bats are a part of this book, because since my interest in all these animals happened, I also have discovered, one day I was I have the unique distinction, I'll say it flat out, of being a matchmaker for bats. I found a bat one day in Minnesota, and it had been warm, and all of a sudden it got very cold, and these bats just started dropping out of the air. And so the first one I saw was close to my house, and I was afraid that the boys were going to come kill it because there were kind of rowdy kids hanging out there. So I decided to put it in a box and take it home, but when I bent down to pick it up, it showed me its fangs, and I quickly changed my mind, and I thought, well, I better protect those kids from this bat. And while I was carrying the bat in the box, I picked up another one, and I heard some scratching around in there, and my hands must have warmed it up. And when I got home, they were mating, and so they probably never would have met otherwise. But that sort of created a long interest in bats. And so the book has bats in it. This is set in Oklahoma in 1922, and people are often asking me why I picked that particular time or what went into this book. And it really begins with family history and family stories, and including the beginning with the beds outside. When I was younger and in Oklahoma, mostly it was so hot that we would sleep out on porches and everything, but you know, the bugs are really bad there. But long before then, when my father was younger, they would just take their beds outside and leave them out. And so it begins with that scene, and a lot of family history, a lot of stories of my family are in this book, as in Calling Myself Home, my first book, which is now called Red Clay because it's been reissued. And it has a picture of my sister and myself on the front going to town to get water because my family didn't have water. And so we carry it in silver milk cans in the wagon with horses back to the house. And I think when I really began writing, thinking about in terms of putting things together, came with a sort of a sudden split one day in time that happened, thinking about a family that had horses and wagons and living in the contemporary world and driving on freeways. And suddenly there became this impulse to start putting it together. And the novel does the same thing. It's a little bit like what I was talking about earlier, about the language of ceremony, needing a language to make things whole, how important that is to us in our lives. Oklahoma, 1922. That summer, a water diviner named Michael Horse forecast a 2-week dry spell. Until then, Horse's predictions were known to be reliable, and since it was a scorching hot summer, a good number of people moved their beds outdoors in hopes a chance breeze would pass over and provide relief from the hot nights. They set them up far from the houses that held the sun's heat long after dark. Cots were unfolded in kitchen gardens. White iron beds sat in horse pastures. 4 posters rested in cornfields that were lying fallow. What a silent bedchamber the world was, just before morning, when even the locusts were still. In that darkness, the white beds were ghostly. They rose up from the black rolling hills and farmlands. Here, a lonely bed sat next to a barbed wire fence, and there, beneath the protection of an oak tree, a man's lantern burned beside his sleeping form. Near the marshland, tents of gauzy mosquito netting sloped down over the bony shoulders and hips of dreamers. A hand hung over the edge of a bed, fingers reaching down toward bluegrass that grew upward in fields. Given half a chance, the vines and leaves would have crept up the beds and overgrown the sleeping bodies of people. In one yard, a nervy chicken wanted to roost on a bed frame and was shooed away. "Go on, scat," an old woman cried out, raising herself half up in bed to push the clucking hen back down to the ground. That would be Belle Greycloud. She was the grandmother of her family. She wore a meteorite on a leather thong around her neck. It had been passed on to her by a man named Osage Star Looking, who'd seen it fall from the sky and smolder in a field. It was her prized possession, although she also had a handwritten book by the old healer Severance. Belle slept alone in the herb garden. The rest of her family believed in varying degrees that they were modern, so they remained inside the oven-hot walls of the house. Belle's grown daughters drowsed off and on throughout the night. The men tossed. The two young people were red-faced and sweating, tangled in their bed linens on sagging mattresses. Belle frightened away the hen, then turned on her side and settled back into the pillow, her silver hair spread over it. Even resting outside in the iron bed, surrounded by night's terrain, she was a commanding woman, with the first morning light on her strong-boned face. A little ways down the road toward Watona, Indian Territory, a forest of burned trees was just becoming visible in morning's red firelight. Not far from there, at the oil fields, the pumps rose and fell, pulling black oil up through layers of rock. Across the way was a greenwood forest, and not even a full mile away from where Belle slept, just a short walk down the dirt road, Grace Blanket and her daughter Nola slept in a bed that was thoughtfully placed in their flower garden. At that time in Oklahoma, there were so many oil wells and derricks, that there was not a visible horizon. And if you've ever been to Oklahoma, you realize that's a lot. She said, leafing through the book, looking for Belle Gray Cloud's next scene. I'm going to go on to, here it is. Okay. The next morning, early, when the charred earth still smelled like smoke, Belle had dragged herself up from her bed and gone to Watona to deliver eggs to an old woman who lived by the railroad depot. She carried with her a bag of mints for Jim Josh and a parcel of books and playing cards for Benoit. On her errands, she walked rapidly past the depot at her usual pace, but then something stopped her in her tracks. Belle stood dead still a moment, turned and looked again at what she hoped was an error of vision. What met her eyes was a truck filled with eagle carcasses. They were golden brown birds with the blue-white membranes of death closed over their eyes. For what seemed like a long time, Belle stood rooted to the spot. Her marrow went cold. She stared at the dead sacred eagles. They looked like a tribe of small, gone people, murdered and taken away in the back of a truck. The hunters were busy beside the truck, counting the eagles. There were 317 carcasses in all. Belle hardly remembered what happened next, except that she dropped her eggs on the road, threw down her bags, and ran toward the truck, yelling at the men. At first they tried to humor her. She was unmoved by their smiles. She was insane, they thought. She screamed, "Yune holies, what have you gone and done this time?" She began removing the dead eagles from the truck. She placed one on a plot of grass. She was crying and talking in a language they didn't understand. They tried to stop her, but even 3 men could not hold her back. She was ruining the eagles they planned to sell, undamaged as souvenirs. "They're just birds," one of them said, trying to reason with the hysterical old woman. But at his words, she became even more agitated. "What have you done?" She charged at them like a goat, and she kicked at their legs. She broke a window out of the truck, and when she pulled her bare hand back, it was bleeding from the cuts. Again, the men tried to pull her away, but again she charged them, screaming and attacking, until they were forced to hold her down on the hard ground. She wailed and cursed while they held her. She spit in their faces and hissed as they talked over how to keep the pesky old woman from assaulting them and their cargo. Finally, 2 of them wrapped her in wool blankets, her arms at her sides, and rolled her up tight. Then they tied the entire blanket roll with rope, lifted her up, and drove her to the jail. Only her face was exposed, and she continued to spit and scream at them like an old witch, her lead-gray hair tangling around her face. One of the men was considerate. He picked up the 3 eggs that hadn't broken, the bag of mints, books, and the deck of playing cards. He left these with the sheriff for the wild old woman, and then the men drove back to the truck and continued to pack the eagles in paper, ice, and wood chips for the long journey by train to taxidermy shops in New York, London, and Philadelphia. One of the reasons I put in the line, one of the men was considerate, is because the perceptions and worldview of the views of the Indian people and the non-Indian people there were so vastly different. And in the book, they even have different constellations from each other and have really no sense of understanding. And it seemed significant that he was considerate, that he behaved thoughtfully, because the crimes that took place, the murders, which were primarily at the beginning of Indian women, the murderers said that they really believed the Indian people were in the way of American progress. And so they felt justified in what they did. And Hale, one of the leaders of the conspiracy, was paroled after he was in prison for only 4 years, and went back to live in the Osage community seemingly without remorse. And his nephew, Burkhart, who's not in the book, but who existed in real life, was also living in that community. And Carol Hunter, who the book is dedicated to, who was a friend of mine and was an Osage scholar and teacher, interviewed this man, Burkhart, about the murders of her own people. She had a lot of courage and a lot more objectivity than most of us have, and talked to him about it. She also had the FBI reports, and the crimes are still a little bit, they're still not clear exactly what happened, because some of the transcripts and court records are missing, and the FBI records came when the Freedom of Information Act went through and the records were sent out. They were mostly blacked out, so it was impossible to garner a lot of information. One character that is one of the more interesting characters is John Stink, who as a boy had scrofula, which is a form of tuberculosis that left his skin blemished, and he had lesions that had an odor, and so the Indian agent there called him Stink, even though his real name was Hatamoy, which meant roaring thunder. And he was sort of a recluse, a hermit, who lived up above town, above a golf course. And he was an oil-rich man, but he did not want to deal with the money and the oil royalties. And so what he did was collect the golf balls from the golfers that were there and sell them back to the men, and then use that money to live on. And he lived outdoors. He had a tent, and he was a real person. In this scene that I'm going to read, what happens is that he, because of his illness, he had a seizure, and he was buried while he was still alive in a shallow traditional grave covered with a mound of stones. And he came to after he was buried, and he had mongrel dogs that he took care of, and between him and the dogs, they got him out, got the stones moved and got him out of the shallow grave. But people in town thought that he was dead and that they were just seeing his ghost. So they did not acknowledge him because they didn't want to make eye contact with the ghost. So what I've done is taken it a step further in the book, and he also believes he's a ghost. And So for part of the book, until it becomes clear that he's a mortal human being, John Stink is wandering around as a ghost. In real life, this happened to him again, only this time he froze to death. And this time he was going to be embalmed. This was a little later, and they took him to the morgue where he thawed out and got up and walked away. And I love these stories. He was a real person, and I love that he did that, but I knew I couldn't put that in fiction because nobody would ever believe it. You know, it's too much. That night, after the men who buried John Stink went to their beds tossing and turning, with visions of John Thomas's bloody throat, the mongrel dogs at the gravesite whined and pawed away at the earth. One dog scratched a hole in the ground. Another pushed a stone away from the mound, and from inside the grave, John Stink felt the rock thump earth. He began to work his arms out of the ropes that held him. He struggled free of the rope, and he moved earth until finally one of his hands found its way through to air, where it was licked by the happy dogs. The dogs were the only witnesses to the miraculous return of John Stink. They were overjoyed that their master rose up from the grave, and when the old man's pockmarked face emerged, they yapped and licked him, and with their aid, Stink managed to pull himself up out of the coffin. He examined himself. His hands were raw, his thick nails broken. He was dressed like a ghost, all right, in a winding sheet. He examined the opening he climbed through. It was, indeed, too small for the emergence of a mortal man. He sat on the ground in the midst of his dogs and tried to remember what had happened. He had just caught a glimpse of Louise Greycloud when he went dead and black. He wasn't shot, so it must have been heart failure that killed him. And now here he was, a ghost, destined to wander limbo. So this is what death was like, he thought, as he wrapped the white sheet tighter around his naked body. Out of habit more than anything else, he started out for his home up on Mare Hill above the golf course. The dogs, who couldn't tell the difference between ghosts and mortals, wagged their tails and followed Stink home. He was surprised that he still wanted a cigar. He always had a cigar. Cigars were big in that time, in that part of Oklahoma. Another main character, I'm going to read this last section here, is Michael Horse, who was a water diviner, a horse trainer. He'd been in the Boxer Rebellion in China, and he wrote calligraphy, and he kept journals, elaborate journals about all these crimes and about the history that was taking place. He inherited a typewriter, so he was typing. And in this scene, he's up at the Hill Settlement, which is a group of traditional people who live up in the hills. And he's staying there, and he's keeping people awake typing. And he's almost finished with what he's working on. And the piece that he's working on is a new chapter to the Bible, the Gospel according to Horse. Because he thinks that some things have been left out of the other Bible and that they need a new chapter. And when the priest comes through, the priest and Horse get into arguments because the priest won't tell Horse how to get this copyrighted and included in the book. And one of the old women asks him to tell what he's been working on, what he's written. He looked hesitant, but he went inside and took papers from within the cedar trunk. Some of the words were written neatly in the script Horse had learned in China. Other pages were typed. First, I have to tell you about the book they call the Bible. It is a holy book for the European people, like those who live in towns. It carries visions, commandments, and songs. I've added what I think is missing from its pages. One of the younger women interrupted him. Why can't you just speak it? They don't believe anything is true unless they see it in writing, he says. Then he explained to the many listeners, you know all this, it's very simple. He began reading, honor Father Sky and Mother Earth. Look after everything. Life resides in all things, even the motionless stones. Take care of the insects, for they have their place, and the plants and trees, for they feed people. Everything on earth, every creature and plant wants to live without pain, so do them no harm. Treat all people in creation with respect. All is sacred, especially the bats. Live gently with the land. We are one with the land. We are part of everything in our world, part of the roundness and cycles of life. And all life is sacred. Pray to the earth, restore yourself and voice, remake your spirit, so that it is in harmony with the rest of nature and the universe. Keep peace with all your brothers and sisters. Humans whose minds are healthy desire such peace and justice. An old man interrupted. Say, isn't that what Peacemaker of the Iroquois nations used to say? Horse looked at the man. The Creator probably spoke the same words to him. It wouldn't surprise me at all. He went on, this is the core of all religion. It is the Creator's history. The Creator who spoke to a white man as clearly as he spoke to me and said to him, as you do unto the least of these, my brothers, you do unto me. The Creator said this, and we abide by it. Father Dunn argued with Horse. You can't add a new chapter to the Bible. Horse furrowed his brow and looked at the priest. Do you think I need more thou shalts? They were all quiet for a while. The owls hooted in the distance. The oldest woman said, he's a philosopher. He was always like that, even when he was a boy. Onanek said, I have something to put in the book. What's that? Asked Horace. Give me liberty or give me death. Her face broke into a wide grin. Then she laughed out loud. Thank you. Questions from the audience. I have to tell you about this Onanek line, the last line in Minnesota. I was talking to a man who said that all of his life they thought that his grandmother did not speak English. She never said a word, so they just assumed that she was never going to learn English. And one day, out of the blue, she just said, George Washington never told a lie. And I loved that, but I couldn't use it in my book because it was his line, so I kind of changed it around a little bit. Any questions? Oh, good. Easy work tonight. You know, I think I heard of that book.
He was interested in healing, and
I have not read it though.
and he was invited by medical centers to come and share some of his knowledge with them. And they had spent time in Oregon, and then they wanted to know about it's really interesting. But I just, that was not the Rolling Thunder that you had.
This is Roaring.
Oh, right.
Yeah. But Denver has a really large Indian community. It was one of the relocation centers during the 50s, which is how some of my family ended up there.
I was thinking it was the same. I heard it the same because I heard the
I'll have to look for, I'll look for this book. Thanks. Yeah.
I'd like to know what happened to the lady that was taken to jail.
The lady that went to jail? Well, she gets out of jail. Her husband comes and gets her. And she lives in the book. So she's a survivor. Actually, it's a lucky thing that she went there that day, because that was the day that Michael Horst was arrested for foretelling that an event was going to happen. And when it did, they thought he was a suspect. And so she was at the jail when they arrested him, so she was able to help get him out of jail too. Okay, thank you. Good night.